Don't you dare get comfortable in that chair. People like you are a stain on the fabric of this room. You don't belong here." The words, sharp as shattered glass, sliced through the elegant hum of the Metropolitan Legacy Gala. The gentle melody of the string quartet faltered. The clinking of crystal and silver ceased. 100 conversations, whispered over champagne and canapes, died in an instant. Heads swiveled, necks craned. The very air in the grand ballroom, once warm with perfume and ambition, turned cold and thin. And then came the laugh. It wasn't a sound of joy. It was high-pitched, metallic, and engineered to inflict maximum damage. Serafina Vanderbilt, draped in a gown the color of fresh blood, leaned over the back of her chair, her smile a predatory slash of red lipstick. A baccarat crystal flute, glittering with vintage Dom Pérignon, was clenched in her manicured fingers. She was the heiress to a dynasty built on steel and shadows, a woman whose cruelty was as legendary as her family's fortune. Without a flicker of hesitation, she inverted the glass. A torrent of pale gold champagne cascaded downward, a liquid waterfall catching the 1,000 fractured lights of the chandelier before it met its target. It slammed into the meticulously styled hair of the woman seated below, a deluge of cold, sticky effervescence. It soaked her scalp in an instant, dripping past her temples, tracing humiliating trails down her jawline, and streaking her custom-made emerald green gown with dark, spreading stains. The dress, a symbol of new life and new money, was now branded with old-world contempt. The sound of the liquid striking fabric, of the fizzing bubbles dying against silk, was obscenely loud in the sudden, suffocating silence of the hall. A collective gasp rippled through the room, a wave of shock and morbid delight. A few muffled snickers broke through the tension, quickly suppressed. A constellation of smartphones rose in unison, their lenses hungry, their screens glowing like the eyes of nocturnal predators zeroing in on a kill. The wife of a disgraced senator covered her mouth with a diamond-encrusted hand, her horror a perfect performance. A clique of young hedge fund managers, their tailored suits straining across their shoulders, leaned back in their chairs, grinning with the unholy glee of men watching a spectacle they knew their money could never buy. Serafina threw her head back and laughed again, a triumphant, conquering sound that echoed off the gilded ceiling. She was basking in the attention, drinking it in like the very champagne she had just wasted. "There!" she boomed, her voice a trumpet of arrogance. "That's much better. Green was never your color, darling. Desperation suits you so much more." "Nah." She dangled the now empty flute for all to see, tilting it back and forth as if it were a newly won trophy. On cue, some of the guests laughed along with her. Others, the ones who understood the delicate ecosystem of power, offered a polite, deferential round of applause. The message was brutally clear. This was not just an insult. This was a public execution, a display of dominance. But the woman in the emerald gown, the biotech CEO Dr. Eris Thorne, did not move. She did not flinch when the cold shock of the champagne hit her skin. She did not recoil. She did not cry out. She did not even attempt to wipe the sticky liquid that was now dripping from her chin onto the pristine white linen of the tablecloth. She simply sat there, her posture ramrod straight, her hands resting calmly on the table. She was a statue carved from defiance, frozen in a moment of profound, unshakable calm. Then her eyes lifted. It was not a hurried glance, not the desperate plea of a victim. It was a slow, deliberate, and chillingly calculated movement. Her gaze, dark and deep, locked onto Serafina's with a quiet, focused intensity that began to suffocate the laughter in the room. One by one, the sycophantic chuckles faltered and died. The ripple of noise collapsed back into a thick, unnerving silence. Serafina shifted her weight, her predatory smirk stiffening at the edges. She tried to force another giggle, tossing her perfectly coiffed blonde hair to play for the crowd. "Come now," she taunted, gesturing with a flick of her wrist toward the glowing phones still aimed at their table. "Don't be shy. Smile for the cameras, darling. Let them see you." Yet, even she could feel it. The current was turning. The spectacle was no longer hers to control. The soaked woman in green didn't need words. Her stillness was heavier than any shout, more potent than any outburst of outrage. Every single drop of champagne that fell from the hem of her sleeve to the marble floor was an unspoken declaration of war. Every second of silence that stretched on built a crushing pressure that Serafina Vanderbilt, for all her inherited power, could not laugh away. The Grand Hall itself, with its vaulted ceilings and priceless art, seemed to bend and warp around Eris Thorne's composure. The chandelier still sparkled high above, but the spotlight had undeniably shifted. The woman dripping with champagne was no longer the object of ridicule. She was becoming something else entirely, something terrifying, something unshakable. She was the center of gravity, and every single gaze in that room was now helplessly, nervously circling her. Before we continue this story, I have to ask you, where are you watching this from? Drop your city, your state, your country in the comments below. We love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you believe in the power of dignity and the certainty of justice, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Stories like this can spark real change, and we're thrilled that you are here to witness it with us. Now, let's get back to her. The hush in the ballroom didn't last. It couldn't. It fractured, breaking not into noise, but into 1,000 coiled whispers that slithered through the room like smoke. A woman draped in heirloom diamonds leaned toward her husband, the stones catching the light as she muttered from behind her hand. "My God, did you see that? She just sat there. Not a tear?" Another man, a real estate tycoon with a face like a clenched fist, chuckled low in his chest, shaking his head. "She won't last 5 minutes in this circle. Not with that kind of weakness. You have to fight back." But not all the whispers carried scorn or morbid curiosity. From the far end of the long, banquet-style table, a guest frowned, his eyes narrowing not at Eris, but at Serafina. He was a tech billionaire, a man who had built his empire from a garage, and he recognized the look in Eris Thorne's eyes. It wasn't weakness. It was a computer processing unimaginable amounts of data. He leaned toward his neighbor, a quiet murmur barely audible above the shutter clicks of a nearby phone camera. "Too far," he said, his voice flat. "That was a mistake, a big one." The phones. Oh God, the phones were everywhere. A dozen different angles were capturing the rivulets of champagne, still dripping from the ends of Aris's hair, catching in the emerald silk of her gown. Each frame was already destined for Instagram stories, for Twitter feeds, for gossip blogs, before the night was even over. Some held their screens high and proud, their faces bathed in the ghoulish blue light, a light with the thrill of witnessing someone else's humiliation. Others tried to be more discreet, pretending to check their messages while their lenses burned the image into digital memory. And then, the laughter rolled back, scattered at first, then gaining momentum like a dirty tide. The group of young hedge fund heirs, emboldened by Serafina's cruelty, clapped one another on the shoulders. One of them, his eyes bright with a particular kind of inherited malice, leaned over to his friend. "She should be grateful," he slurred, his words thick with entitlement. "That bottle of Dom cost more than her entire tacky outfit." Their laughter was loud, braying, and harsh, a deliberate attempt to fill the void left by Eris Thorne's refusal to scream, to cry, to react. A woman in pearls, seated near Serafina, smirked as she delicately adjusted her napkin in her lap. Serafina is right. She doesn't belong here. Look at her. She can't even defend herself. Pathetic. Serafina, hearing these murmurs of support, lifted her empty flute once more, a conductor leading her orchestra of derision. She executed a mocking little curtsy toward the still figure in green, basking in the wave of validation from her peers. "A toast," she announced, her voice ringing with false cheer. "To the outsiders." More laughter, more applause, the clinking of glasses. Yet beneath the cacophony, a dangerous tension was beginning to stir. Not everyone was laughing. A pair of senior investment bankers, seated behind their menus, whispered with concern etched onto their faces. "She's the head of Lyra Therapeutics, isn't she?" one muttered. "The one our firm is courting for the Vanguard partnership?" The other nodded grimly, his eyes darting nervously toward the woman drenched in champagne. The very same. Their amusement had curdled into a cold dread. They knew what was at stake, the sheer scale of the capital involved, even if the drunken heiress in red did not. Meanwhile, Dr. Eris Thorne remained a statue of composure. She did not wipe the liquid pooling at her collarbone. She did not rise to her own defense. Her silence became its own kind of performance, a perfect, polished mirror in which every cruel voice, every ugly laugh, was forced to see its own reflection. The louder the crowd jeered, the more her quiet dignity magnified their collective ugliness. One young guest, a recent Ivy League graduate, lowered his phone. He suddenly felt a hot flush of shame. He slipped the device into his pocket and stared intently at his water glass instead. The woman beside him, his date, frowned, her own laughter faltering as she watched the still, wine-soaked but unbroken figure. Something about the scene no longer felt amusing. It felt dangerous, as if the entire, gilded room was holding its breath, waiting for an inevitable and terrible turn. Serafina, gloriously oblivious, blew a kiss toward her audience of cameras. "Remember this night." "Hi," she shouted, spinning theatrically in her blood-red dress. "This is what happens when you try to sit at a table where you don't belong." Her laughter burst out again, high and wild, a frantic sound that filled every corner of the opulent hall. But in the quiet space beneath that laughter, in the charged pause between the gasps and the claps, eyes were beginning to shift. The balance was changing. Not everyone was laughing anymore. Not everyone was blind to what was about to come. And at the center of it all, champagne dripping steadily, rhythmically, onto the priceless marble floor, Dr. Eris Thorne waited. Her gaze had never wavered. Her war had already begun. The champagne dripped down her temple, slid past her cheek like a cold tear, and vanished into the emerald folds of her gown. Still, she sat with her back straight, her hands resting lightly on the table as if nothing more than a minor spill had occurred. Around her, the room hummed with a nervous, crackling energy. Laughter that was now too loud to be genuine, whispers that were too sharp to be casual, the clinking of glasses now used to mask a growing unease. But when her eyes lifted again, the noise seemed to dim, to recede into the background. She looked first at the empty flute in Serafina's hand, the weapon that had been turned into a trophy. Then she raised her gaze higher, letting it settle on the face of the woman in red. The self-satisfied smirk on Serafina's lips faltered. It was only for a fraction of a second, a barely perceptible flicker, but in that moment of stillness, the watchful crowd caught it. Eris Thorne's stare was deliberate, unhurried, and it pierced through the layers of arrogance and entitlement like a surgeon's scalpel. She didn't need to speak. The silence wrapped around her like a suit of armor, and the sheer weight of it pressed down on the room. Her composure became the loudest thing in the hall, A ripple of profound discomfort spread through the onlookers. One guest shifted in his chair, suddenly acutely aware of how loud and ugly his own laughter had sounded just a moment ago. Another lowered her phone, a flush of shame coloring her cheeks at having been caught recording such a cruel act. The cameras were still pointed in her direction, but their owners were no longer certain they wanted proof of what they were witnessing. A spectacle of humiliation had somehow transformed into a masterclass in power. Serafina tossed her hair, forcing a brittle, fragile laugh. "What? No comeback? Cat got your tongue?" She sneered, but her voice cracked just slightly at the edges. She leaned closer, waving her empty glass in a gesture of mock triumph. "You should honestly thank me. No stylist in the world could ever make you stand out like this." Her cruelty met only a wall of silence. And then, slowly, Eris blinked. It was one single, measured blink, her long lashes heavy with champagne. When her eyes opened again, they were calm, cold, and utterly unflinching. It was the look of someone who had already calculated every possible outcome, run every simulation, and had already decided the final result. It was the look of someone who held the power to end this entire charade with a single thought. Serafina felt it. A cold chill ran down her spine. She took an involuntary step back, just a half step, but it was enough. Those watching noticed. The whispers stirred again, this time with a different quality. "Did you see that?" someone whispered. "She's not even angry." Another voice replied, a tone of uneasy awe in his voice. "No, she's not angry. She's waiting." Eris adjusted her posture slightly, a minute shift that seemed to draw all the energy in the room toward her. She lifted one hand, not to wipe away the champagne, but to place it gently on the stem of her own water glass. Her fingers, long and steady, curled around it with a quiet, unnerving certainty. The movement was small, but it commanded the attention of every person in that hall. Her gaze never, for a single second, left Serafina. She let the silence stretch, a silence thick enough to drown out the mocking giggles that tried and failed to spark back to life. The crowd leaned in without realizing they were doing it, drawn by the incredible gravity of her stillness. And in that charged, terrifying pause, something fundamental shifted. The spectacle no longer belonged to the woman in red. The spotlight had moved. Every eye in that room was on the drenched figure at the table, not as a victim, not as an object of pity, but as the calm, terrifying center of a storm that no one else could see coming. Serafina forced another laugh, too loud, too hollow, a desperate sound in a room that was no longer listening. She waved to the crowd, as if to reclaim their attention, but her eyes flicked nervously back to the woman she had tried and failed to humiliate. And what she saw staring back at her was not weakness. It was a warning. The banquet hall buzzed with a tension so thick it felt like you could cut it with a knife. Guests leaned closer to one another, their voices lowered to urgent, frantic whispers, the unease spreading like a network of fine cracks across a sheet of glass. The champagne kept dripping. The silence kept deepening. And at the center of it all, Dr. Eris Thorne's eyes told a story that no one else dared to speak aloud. "This isn't over. It has just begun." Serafina shifted her weight, her Louboutin heels clicking softly against the marble as she desperately tried to reclaim the rhythm of the room, a rhythm she had so confidently commanded just minutes before. Her smile widened, but it was brittle at the edges, the kind of manic grin that dared the crowd to laugh with her or risk being seen as standing against her. She twirled the empty champagne flute in her fingers and let it dangle carelessly at her side. "Oops," she announced, her voice dripping with a mock innocence, so theatrical it was insulting. "I guess I just got carried away. But come on, everyone, look at her. She actually looks better this way, don't you think?" She gestured with a grand, sweeping motion toward Eris, who was still seated, still silent, still dripping champagne like a statue carved from pure resolve. A few obedient, nervous chuckles followed her cue. A smattering of applause rose from her loyal inner circle, a desperate attempt to keep their queen's ego intact. One man, a sycophant who managed a portion of her family's trust, even clapped too loudly, his laugh bouncing around the cavernous hall like broken glass. But beyond that shallow, shrinking ring of supporters, the atmosphere had soured. Guests exchanged wary, uncomfortable looks. A woman covered her discomfort by taking a long, slow sip of her champagne. An older gentleman, a pillar of the city's philanthropic community, began meticulously adjusting his cufflinks, staring intently at the tablecloth rather than the horrifying spectacle unfolding before him. Serafina tilted her head back, basking in what she tragically mistook for admiration. She raised her chin, her blood-red dress catching the light, the diamonds at her ears flashing with every exaggerated theatrical gesture. She was undeniably beautiful, a product of generations of wealth and breeding. But tonight, her beauty had curdled into something sharp, ugly, and arrogant. She strutted around Eris's chair like a performer on a stage, her heels tapping out a relentless rhythm of disdain. "Tell me." She leaned in close to Eris, her cloying, expensive perfume filling the air, a stark contrast to the sour tang of the champagne. Her tone was a venomous whisper meant to be overheard. "How does it feel to sit among us? To wear your little custom-made dress and pretend that you actually belong? Did you really think no one would notice you were an imposter?" The room held its breath. Every single syllable was a targeted strike. Every pregnant pause was a calculated insult. Serafina wanted to break her target, not just with the public humiliation of the champagne, but with words designed to strip away every layer of her dignity until nothing remained but raw, exposed shame. And then she laughed again, louder this time, shriller, turning her head back toward the crowd of onlookers. "Don't be shy, everyone. Take a good, long look. This is what happens when you climb too high, too fast." Phones flashed. Glasses clinked. But the energy supporting her was thinner now, stretched taut, ready to snap. Even those who were still laughing felt the cold unease coiling in their stomachs. There was a nagging, persistent thought that the joke had gone too far, that a line had been crossed from which there was no return. Dr. Eris Thorne remained immovable. Her silence was becoming more and more dangerous, like the eerie calm of the air just before a tornado touches down. She did not speak, but her presence, her sheer force of will, said enough. Her gaze followed Serafina with a calm, unnerving precision, tracking her every exaggerated movement as if she were a predator measuring the distance to her prey, calculating the cost of each and every insult. Serafina tried to hold that gaze but found herself glancing away, her own bravado failing her. She spun again, tossing her hair, twirling the empty glass in frantic, pointless circles. She leaned deeper into her role, desperately convinced that her performance could erase the tremor of doubt that was beginning to creep into her chest. "Smile for the cameras," she sneered, lowering her voice just enough for those nearest to hear. "This will be the only headline you'll ever make." Her laughter spilled out once more, but it sounded different now. Thinner, more desperate, fighting against the heavy, oppressive silence that was pressing back from the woman she had tried and failed to destroy. And across the table, across the hall, people were beginning to see it. This cruel, pathetic show was no longer amusing. It was unraveling. Serafina Vanderbilt didn't know it yet, but the moment she poured that champagne, she had lit a very long fuse. And the woman she was mocking was the one holding the match. The laughter spread again, though it was thinner this time, as forced and unpleasant as champagne that had gone flat. A handful of guests, the ones whose fortunes were inextricably linked to the Vanderbilts, tapped their hands against the table, eager to keep the cruel mood alive, eager to prove they stood on the side of old money and established power. Their voices rose in a shallow, pathetic chorus of agreement. "That's right," one young man, whose grandfather had been the Vanderbilts' chauffeur, barked from the far end of the table. His gaudy cufflinks caught the light as he raised his glass. "Outsiders should learn their place." His words drew a ripple of uneasy, hesitant chuckles. Another, emboldened by the first, leaned back in his chair and spoke far louder than he should have. "If she wants to play with giants, she better learn how to take a joke." His friends laughed too loudly, a desperate performance to prove they belonged to the same exclusive circle of cruelty. Serafina soaked it all in. She turned to them, grinning, her arms spread wide as if she were embracing the room itself. "See?" she declared, her voice dripping with a satisfaction that was rapidly becoming manic. "They understand." She basked in the dwindling attention, twirling her glass like a royal scepter. "This is what happens when you forget where you came from." But cracks were forming in her carefully constructed reality. Not everyone was laughing. At the adjacent table, a woman whispered sharply to her husband, "This is ugly, Robert, truly ugly." He just cleared his throat and glanced away, unwilling to meet her eyes, unwilling to challenge the power in the room. In another corner, the two investment bankers exchanged another look, this one heavy with unspoken, frantic calculations. "She's the sole private partner on the Vanguard Philanthropic Fund, isn't she?" one murmured, his voice barely audible. The other gave the faintest, almost imperceptible nod. Both men fell silent, staring down at their plates, unwilling to join the farce any longer. Yet the cruel chorus kept going. Phones hovered higher, their lenses recording every humiliating detail. One guest deliberately angled his camera to frame Eris's drenched figure, zooming in on the streaks of champagne running down her skin. He chuckled to himself, already mentally composing the vicious captions he would post online later. "Smile!" someone shouted from across the hall, their voice anonymous in the crowd. "Give us a good shot for the gram!" A roar of laughter followed, echoing off the marble columns, bouncing under the glittering, indifferent chandeliers. Serafina twirled once more, her red dress swirling dramatically around her legs. She blew a kiss to the crowd, delighting in the mock applause. "Don't forget this night," she cried, raising her empty glass high. "It's the night an imposter finally got exposed." She bowed with theatrical exaggeration, reveling in her performance. The loyal ring of guests clapped harder, their laughter rising again, desperate to feed her ego and keep the party going. But the energy was hollow now, sustained by habit and fear more than any genuine joy. And in the center of it all, Dr. Eris Thorne still sat in a profound, earth-shattering silence. Her stillness only magnified the cruelty around her, reflecting every laugh and every jeer back onto those who gave them voice. One of the guests noticed. The young man with the cruel comment lowered his phone slowly, slipping it into his pocket, his eyes flicking guiltily toward the floor. A woman near him stopped laughing mid-breath, covering her mouth as if suddenly ashamed of the sound she had just made. The balance of power was shifting, subtly but undeniably. Serafina, too intoxicated by her own bravado, didn't see it. She bowed again, her blonde hair cascading over her shoulders, her laughter high and shrill and desperate. "This is who she is," she shouted, pointing a dramatic, trembling finger at the soaked woman at the table. "And this is all she'll ever be." The applause answered her, but it was softer this time, scattered, uncertain. The spell was breaking. Yet Serafina only smiled wider, blind to the silence that was growing in the spaces between the laughs. She believed she was winning. She didn't know the floor beneath her was already beginning to crack. The champagne dripped slower now, dark stains spreading like continents across the emerald fabric, but Dr. Eris Thorne did not move. She sat anchored, as though the chair itself were a throne, and the entire grand hall had unwillingly, unknowingly become her court. Her silence was not surrender. It was a weapon being calibrated. In her mind, the scene replayed, but not the scene in the room. She saw the sterile boardroom from that very morning, the crisp slide of legal documents across a polished mahogany table, the looping scroll of her signature next to the Vanderbilt family crest, the press release, drafted but not yet published, celebrating the landmark partnership. And the numbers that stretched into the billions, 3.8 billion to be exact. A philanthropic fund designed to salvage the Vanderbilt's tarnished public image, a partnership celebrated by the financial press as unshakable. And now, within the span of a single hour, her so-called partner's sister had turned that alliance into a grotesque spectacle of public humiliation. Serafina laughed again, tossing her hair, clinging to the sound of her own arrogance as if it were a life raft. "What's wrong?" she mocked, leaning in close enough for her cloying perfume to clash with the sour tang of champagne. "Cat got your tongue? I thought these powerful new money women always had something to say." Eris's eyes didn't flicker. She studied her tormentor with an unnerving, analytical calm, her gaze slow and deliberate. She wasn't looking at the spilled champagne. She wasn't looking at the jeering crowd. She was looking at the arrogance itself, measuring it, weighing it, and deciding its exact cost. "You think this is power?" The thought was a whisper of ice in the silent furnace of her mind. A glass, a laugh, a crowd of sycophants eager to clap for cruelty. You are children playing with toys. Real power doesn't need an audience. Real power changes the numbers that built this room. Real power rewrites the contracts your family clings to for its very survival. The din of voices around her blurred into a dull, meaningless hum. Every insult, every laugh, every whispered comment merged into a single, irrelevant background noise. All she could hear clearly was the echo of her own resolve. She had come from nothing, from the cracked pavements of Oakland, raised by a grandmother who worked 3 jobs and taught her that dignity was the only currency that could never be stolen. She had fought for every grant, every patent, every round of funding that built her company, Lyra Therapeutics, into a global titan. She had faced down boardrooms of hostile old men who looked at her with the same dismissal as the woman in red. She had survived. She had conquered. This was nothing. She placed one hand flat on the table, steady, firm. The gesture was small, but it commanded attention. A few nearby guests glanced down, sensing a shift, a change in the atmospheric pressure but unable to name it. Her other hand moved with equal care, lifting the folded linen napkin from her lap. She dabbed gently at her jawline, removing a single line of champagne without hurry, without distress. It was not a gesture of weakness. It was a gesture of absolute control. Serafina smirked, seeing only what she wanted to see. "Finally, cleaning yourself up, are we? About time?" Her words were loud, meant to be heard across the room, but they stumbled in the air, brittle and weak against the profound silence that followed Aris's calm, deliberate movements. Inside Aris's mind, the final calculation was made. The decision crystallized. Every insult, every laugh, every single drop of champagne sliding down her skin was tallied, converted into a numerical value on a balance sheet of consequence. The sum was clear. $3.8 billion, erased with a single word. Her eyes rose once more, meeting Serafina's gaze directly. It was not a glare, not even defiance. It was certainty, the kind of cold, hard certainty that unsettled even the most reckless and arrogant of souls. Across the hall, a few guests shifted uneasily in their chairs. They couldn't explain it, but they felt it. The gathering storm behind those calm, dark eyes, the terrifying inevitability of the consequence that was about to be unleashed. Serafina faltered again, just for a second. She raised her chin higher, trying to smother the seed of doubt with another forced laugh. But the crack in her facade had already appeared. And in the silent, charged space between them, Dr. Eris Thorne thought only one thing. Your family believes they poured champagne on me. They don't see that I'm about to pour their entire future down the drain. The napkin slid back onto the table, folded with meticulous care, as though the stain upon it meant nothing at all. Dr. Eris Thorne's hands returned to their stillness. Her gaze swept the hall, not hurried, not seeking sympathy, but merely observing. She was an anthropologist studying the bizarre, self-destructive rituals of a dying tribe. Each guest felt the weight of her eyes as they passed over them. Some averted their faces, suddenly fascinated by the pattern on their plates. Others pretended to take a sip of champagne, hiding behind their glasses. The air grew dense, fragile, every sound, a cough, a scraped chair, sharp and loud against the silence, she commanded. Serafina, a predator sensing her prey was not behaving as expected, mistook that quiet for victory. She strutted closer, her heels striking the marble with a deliberate, rhythmic click. "There it is," she announced loudly, turning to the crowd as if delivering the final line of a play. The silence of someone who knows, deep down, that she doesn't belong. A few loyalists clapped on cue. A nervous, hesitant ripple of laughter followed. But it died quickly. The CEO remained unbothered, an island of calm in a sea of unease. Her stillness was no longer defensive. It was strategic. It was the coiled quiet of a viper before it strikes. She reached for her phone, which had been lying face down on the table. The screen lit up her palm with a soft, ethereal glow. Her fingers moved with an unhurried, terrifying precision, tapping once, twice. She lifted the phone to her ear. The shift in the room was immediate and seismic. The crowd leaned in, their morbid curiosity piqued. Serafina tilted her head, a smirk playing on her lips. "Oh, is she calling for help?" she sneered. "Maybe her driver can bring her a towel." Her words were sharp, but her voice was a little too quick, a little too eager to fill the space. When Eris's tone came, it was nothing like Serafina's theatrics. It was calm, cold, and quiet. Yet each syllable dropped like a piece of dry ice into the silence, freezing the air around it. "Liquidate the vanguard position," she said. "Effective immediately, all of it." A hush fell over the room that was heavier, deeper, and more absolute than before. The grand hall seemed to contract, the very air pressing inward. Even the string quartet in the far corner, who had been nervously waiting for a cue, stumbled in their silent preparations, their bows faltering against the strings. Conversations froze mid-whisper, eyes widened. Glances darted from person to person, seeking confirmation of what they thought they had just heard. She ended the call without flourish, without a dramatic snap of her phone. She simply set it down beside her plate as though it were a piece of silverware, an afterthought. Then she folded her hands once more, her posture steady, her eyes fixed forward. Serafina blinked, her laugh caught in her throat. What did she say?" she asked, forcing another chuckle, but it rang hollow, a dead sound in a dead room. No one answered her. The crowd's focus had shifted entirely. They no longer looked at the woman in red. Their eyes, wide with a dawning horror, were now clinging to the drenched figure at the table, the one who had spoken just 7 words and, in doing so, had shifted the tectonic plates of power beneath their very feet. A man at the far end of the table, one of the investment bankers, pulled out his own phone, his fingers scrolling frantically. The color drained from his face. He nudged his neighbor, whispering urgently, his words lost in the growing buzz. Another guest's screen lit up, displaying a flashing red alert from a financial terminal. The whispers grew faster, sharper, a panicked hiss spreading through the room. She can't mean the deal. The Vanguard Philanthropic Fund. Today's deal? It was a $3.8 billion partnership. Serafina's smile wavered, then cracked. She tried to wave her empty glass again, to reclaim her command of the room. She's bluffing, she scoffed, but her eyes flickered nervously, betraying a deep, sudden doubt. Dr. Eris Thorne said nothing more. She didn't need to. Her silence was louder than any declaration. The weight of what she had just done began to settle across the hall like volcanic ash after an eruption, choking the air, covering everything in a fine gray dust of consequence. Serafina laughed one last time. It was a loud, strained, desperate sound. But fewer people joined in this time. The performance was unraveling, and she was the only one who didn't realize how completely, how irrevocably, she had lost control. At the center of it all, soaked in champagne yet utterly untouchable, Dr. Eris Thorne sat in perfect composure, her silence now a verdict that had already been delivered. The seconds stretched long, each one a lifetime, every eye in the room darting between the immovable woman in green and the unraveling woman in red. The low buzz of whispers grew into a frantic rumble, words colliding, scattering, rising again in panicked crests. Somewhere near the back, a phone chimed with a stock alert, a sharp, piercing sound. Another followed, and then another, a cascade of digital alarms sounding the death knell of the Vanderbilt's last hope. The first man to glance at his screen went pale, a sickly, ghostly white. "Oh my God," he muttered, his fingers trembling as he scrolled through the breaking news. "It's real. She's pulling out. The Vanguard Fund is being liquidated." His neighbor leaned over, his eyes widening in disbelief at the numbers flashing in stark red across the display. One by one, screens lit up around the room like a sudden spreading contagion. Notifications from Bloomberg, from the Wall Street Journal, from Reuters, spread like wildfire. The contract, the investment, the billions gone in an instant. The headlines weren't even written yet, but the financial tremors were already shaking the foundations of the grand hall. A woman in a Chanel gown clutched her husband's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his sleeve. She couldn't have... The words trailed off into a haze of disbelief. "She did," he whispered back, his voice raw with a mixture of terror and awe. $3.8 billion, wiped clean, with a single phone call. The string quartet had stopped playing altogether. Their bows hung frozen above the strings, its members waiting for a permission to continue that would never come. The only rhythm left in the room was the frantic clicking of Serafina's heels on the marble as she paced back and forth, her smile now a grotesque, cracking mask of denial. "She's bluffing," she insisted, her voice louder now, desperate, pleading with the room to believe her over the evidence on their own screens. "This is a party trick. A little drama, that's all it is." Her laugh was high and shrill, but no one echoed it this time. Not a single person. Heads were bent over glowing screens instead. Conversations snapped back and forth like sparks from a downed power line. "It's gone. The entire Lyra seed position is gone. Check the market futures. Vanderbilt Consolidated is going to cliff dive at the opening bell. Do you understand what this means for them? After the shipping scandal, this fund was their lifeline." Serafina spun toward the crowd, her arms outstretched in a gesture of desperate appeal. "Why are you all staring at your phones? She can't do this. My brother, our family, we control this city." But her voice no longer filled the room. It was swallowed by the truth that was scrolling across every device, by the profound, terrifying weight of the silence that was building around the soaked figure who had uttered just 7 words and undone an empire's worth of arrogance. Dr. Eris Thorne reached for her water glass, not the empty flute wielded like a weapon, but her own, still half full. She lifted it with a calm, unshaken hand, her movements steady despite the champagne dripping down her sleeve. She raised it to her lips, sipped once, a small, deliberate act of normalcy in a room that had descended into chaos. Then she set it back down with a quiet, graceful click. No announcement, no explanation, only composure. The hall erupted, not with laughter, not with applause, but with a storm of whispers that felt louder than any cheer had before. Chairs scraped against the floor as guests leaned toward one another, frantically piecing together what had just unraveled before their eyes. Some sat rigid in their seats, too stunned to move. Others were already scribbling notes on napkins, their minds already turning to the boardrooms and headlines that waited for them outside these gilded doors. Serafina's breathing quickened, becoming shallow, ragged. She spun back toward the woman she had tried to humiliate, her red dress clinging to her as though even the fabric knew the fire had burned out. "You think you can scare me with this pathetic little game?" she demanded, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her. Iris finally lifted her eyes again, as calm as ever, meeting her tormentor's gaze with the same unflinching, diamond-hard steel. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The room itself, with its chorus of panicked whispers and glowing screens, answered for her, because everyone in that room now understood. This wasn't theater. This was power. Raw, absolute, and terrifyingly real. Serafina's frantic, desperate laughter tried to rise again, but it was brittle and forced, breaking into a sound like a sob before it could fill the room. The audience no longer belonged to her. The guests had shifted in their seats, a physical and psychological realignment of allegiance. Their faces, lit with the cold, unforgiving glow of their screens, were a sea of shock and fear. Their murmurs had sharpened with urgency. No one cared for her theatrics anymore. They cared for numbers, for markets, for the earthquake that was trembling beneath their own fortunes. One man near the head of the table, a rival of the Vanderbilt family, barked into his phone, his voice trembling with a mixture of panic and predatory glee. "Sell," he commanded. "Sell all of our Vanderbilt holdings. Sell now." His words carried like a flare in the night, sparking more calls, more frantic whispers, a cascade of financial ruin. A woman in silk gripped her clutch so tightly her knuckles whitened. She stared across the table at the drenched figure of Eris Thorne and whispered, almost to herself, "She really did it. The madwoman actually did it." Serafina spun on her heels, her red dress fanning out dramatically, as if movement alone could somehow pull the spotlight back to her. "Don't listen to her!" she shouted, her voice ragged, but her words rang hollow, swallowed by the rising storm of panic she had unleashed. "She can't. She doesn't have the power. My brother, our family." But the crowd wasn't listening to her anymore. They had seen enough. They had heard enough. The profound silence of Dr. Eris Thorne had spoken louder and with more authority than her rival's shrill, pathetic protests. Iris, still seated, adjusted her posture with an effortless grace. She placed her hands flat against the linen tablecloth, her fingers relaxed, her eyes scanning the hall as though she were a general surveying a battlefield after a decisive victory. The champagne stains on her dress glistened in the light, But they no longer looked like marks of humiliation. They looked like battle scars. They looked like a crown painted in liquid gold. One guest, the tech billionaire from earlier, dared to speak the truth aloud. "She owns the floor now." His voice was low, but heads around him nodded in solemn agreement. It was undeniable. Serafina's mask finally cracked, shattering completely. She turned back toward Eris, her voice trembling beneath the crushing weight of her fury. "Do you have any idea who I am?" she spat, her words brittle and sharp. "Do you know what family I come from?" Eris lifted her gaze, unhurried, as if waking from a long thought. For the first time since the phone call, she spoke again. Her tone was calm, clear, and it cut through the air like a blade of obsidian. "I don't need to know who you are," she said. "What matters is who you'll be after tonight." The line fell with the heavy, final thud of a guillotine across the banquet hall. Guests exhaled sharply, some gasping, others nodding as though they had been waiting for her to speak those very words. The sentence was measured, not loud, yet it echoed with more force than any of Serafina's screams. Serafina Vanderbilt staggered a step back, clutching her empty glass so tightly it was a wonder it didn't shatter in her hand. Her eyes, wide with a dawning horror, betrayed the fear she could no longer hide. She tried to laugh it off, to twirl again, to resurrect the performance. But her movements were jerky and uncoordinated. The performance was over, and she knew it. Meanwhile, Eris Thorne's silence returned, heavier and more profound than before. She had given them only one sentence, yet it was enough to fracture the night into a clear before and after. Around the room, guests whispered furiously, their voices weaving a new narrative, not of humiliation, but of a brutal, swift, and legendary reckoning. The champagne on her skin glistened like firelight. The room, unconsciously, had bowed to her presence. And as she sat there, still as stone, Serafina finally realized something she had never believed possible. Her laughter, her name, her entire world, it had lost all of its power. The red-dressed heiress stood frozen, her chest rising and falling too fast, her smirk stretched thin and taut across trembling lips. Around her, the grand banquet no longer resembled a celebration. It felt like a tribunal, and every eye had turned not toward her, the accuser, but toward the woman she had tried to drown in champagne. Dr. Eris Thorne leaned back slightly in her chair. It was not the slouch of weariness, but the relaxed recline of a queen who is utterly, completely comfortable on her throne. The champagne stains, once meant as marks of ridicule, now clung to her dress like medals of defiance. Each drop that touched the marble floor below seemed to echo louder than the forced, ugly laughter of minutes ago. The phones were still raised, but their purpose had changed. They were no longer recording a humiliation. They were documenting a legend. Guests whispered into their devices, sending frantic messages, their lenses framing Eris not as a victim, but as a force of nature, immortalizing the exact moment the balance of power in their world had shifted forever. One man, a grizzled old money patriarch, whispered to his wife, "We're watching history being made." She nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving the drenched, magnificent woman in green. Serafina tried one last, desperate gambit. "You all know my family," she pleaded, her voice cracking, too shrill, too frantic. "You all know my brother. We built this city. She can't just erase us." But the room had moved on. A cluster of investors were huddled together, their hushed tones carrying across the silence. $3.8 billion, gone with a single phone call, one said, shaking his head in disbelief. Another, awe etched into his features, replied, "She didn't even raise her voice." The sheer weight of those words settled heavily over the room. Some guests now looked at Serafina with a cold pity, others with an open contempt, but none with the reverence she so desperately craved. Aris lifted her water glass again. Slowly, deliberately, she took another sip. The motion was unhurried, a quiet act of defiance that declared she owned not just her own dignity, but the entire room, and everyone in it. The simple act drowned out every one of Serafina's frantic protests, every nervous laugh that tried to bubble up. And then she set the glass down with a soft, final click against the table. That sound carried more authority than all of Serafina's shouting. Finally, Aris spoke, her voice calm, steady, the kind of tone that carried further than any scream. "This room," she began, "celebrates wealth, power, and legacy. But you are all mistaken about what those things are. They aren't inherited in a trust fund or displayed in a glass of champagne. They are built, they are earned, and they are protected." Her words slid through the crowd like an electric current. Heads tilted forward, listening, absorbing. Phones recorded with a renewed, desperate urgency. Serafina stiffened, her face flushing a blotchy red against the golden glow of the chandeliers. Aris continued, never raising her volume, yet each word struck harder than the last. "Tonight you tried to humiliate me. You tried to tell me I don't belong. But what you've actually done is remind every single person in this room that true power is not about spectacle. It's about consequence." A silence heavier than marble settled over the hall. Guests sat motionless, waiting, watching, unwilling to miss a single breath of what would come next. Serafina clutched her empty flute like a shield, her knuckles white, her eyes darting wildly around the room, searching for someone, anyone, to rescue her from the silence that had turned against her. But no one moved. No one spoke for her. All they saw now was the woman seated in green, drenched but unshaken, her calm, formidable presence making the grand hall itself feel like it had bent to her will. And in that silence, it became brutally, undeniably clear. Serafina wasn't in control anymore. She was just a girl in a red dress, standing in the ruins of her own arrogance, while Dr. Aris Thorne sat, composed and untouchable, in the unshakable center of real power. The air in the banquet hall felt charged, as if lightning had struck. But the thunder had not yet rolled, leaving a buzzing, ozone-laced silence in its wake. Guests sat rigid, their breaths shallow, their gazes pinned to the woman in green who had single-handedly transformed an act of public humiliation into an act of absolute dominance. Serafina's red dress shimmered under the chandelier, but its brilliance no longer commanded the room. It clung to her like a shroud of desperation, the fabric of someone who had lost everything. She tried once more, her voice trembling as she forced the words out. "This is nonsense. You can't just... Contracts, deals, they don't end like that. You think you can just walk in here and undo everything my family has built over a century?" Aris Thorne's eyes lifted slowly, her stare locking on to Serafina with such calm, devastating finality that the younger woman faltered mid-sentence. The crowd leaned in, holding their collective breath, waiting for the final blow. "Power," Aris said, her voice soft, almost a whisper, yet it carried to every corner of the silent room. "Doesn't ask for permission?" It wasn't shouted. It wasn't dramatic, but it landed with a weight that crushed every last whisper of defiance in the room. The guests froze, their screens glowing faintly in their hands, capturing a sentence that they knew would echo in boardrooms and on trading floors for years to come. Serafina's lips parted, but no words came out. For the first time that night, she looked small, her empty glass trembling in her hand, her laughter gone, her arrogance completely unraveled and lying in pieces at her feet. From the far end of the table, an older man in a tailored suit, a longtime rival of the Vanderbilts, muttered under his breath, She's finished. The man beside him leaned closer, replying, "No, they're finished. All of them." The murmurs swelled again, but this time they carried a different tone. Not mockery, not scorn. It was fear. It was respect. It was awe. The tide had not just turned. It had become a tsunami, and everyone in the room knew it. Aris adjusted her posture, champagne still dripping faintly from the hem of her dress, and rested her chin lightly against her hand. She didn't need to speak further. Her silence was now the verdict. Her composure was the sentence. Serafina stumbled a step back, her heel catching for a moment against the smooth marble. She looked around frantically for support, for the friends who had laughed with her, for the allies who had clapped at her cruelty, but their eyes refused to meet hers. They were all too busy looking at the woman she had tried and failed to shame. The woman who had, in the space of 10 minutes, revealed herself to be utterly and completely untouchable. Even the string quartet, still frozen in the corner, seemed to be waiting on Aris's unspoken command to resume playing. The entire hall, the entire social and financial ecosystem it represented, had realigned around her presence. Serafina finally slammed her glass down on a nearby side table. The baccarat crystal, unable to withstand the force of her rage and desperation, cracked with a sharp, sickening sound. "This isn't over," she hissed, though her voice shook too much to be convincing. She spun away, her red dress swirling like a dying fire losing its oxygen, and stormed toward the grand exit doors. But her departure was not a triumph. It was a retreat. A rout. Dr. Eris Thorne did not rise. She didn't need to. She simply watched, her eyes steady and calm, until the doors closed behind the woman in red. The silence that followed was thick, absolute, and profound. And then, slowly, the whispers began again. Not about scandal, but about legacy, about power, about the $3.8 billion that were shifted with a single, quiet phone call, about the woman who had endured a baptism of humiliation and had walked away as the only name that mattered. In that moment, the hall itself seemed to bow, not to the wealth that was inherited, but to the strength that was earned. The grand doors shut with a hollow final thud, and the echo lingered like the last note of a requiem. Serafina Vanderbilt was gone, but the ugly stain of her arrogance still hung in the air, now stripped bare for all to see. What had begun as her spectacle had ended as a profound silence, a silence that belonged entirely to the woman still seated, with regal calm, at the center of the hall. Dr. Eris Thorne lifted her water glass one final time. The chandelier's glow danced across its rim, and for a heartbeat, the crowd saw not the stains on her dress, not the champagne dripping faintly to the marble, but the unshakable poise of a leader who had turned mockery into mastery. She took a slow, deliberate sip, set the glass down with a quiet grace, and looked around the room. One by one, eyes dropped before hers. Phones were lowered. Whispers died. No one dared to laugh now. No one dared to sneer. The guests who had eagerly joined in the cruelty just minutes earlier now sat rigid in their chairs, a hot flush of shame pooling in the silence. Others, those who had watched with a quiet unease, now leaned forward with a respect they could no longer disguise. She spoke, her voice steady, low, and carrying with an easy authority through the hushed hall. "Dignity," she said, "doesn't vanish when wine is poured on it. It doesn't shatter under the weight of laughter. Dignity endures. And tonight, every single person in this room has learned who truly holds it." The words settled like stone, immovable, undeniable. A new murmur spread through the room, but this time it was not one of mockery or panic. It was acknowledgement. Investors exchanged glances heavy with new calculations. A woman at the far end whispered to her companion, "She owns this room. She owns the future." The reply came as a grim, certain nod. "And she owns the deal that is now gone forever." At last, Eris rose from her chair. The movement was slow, unhurried, yet it rippled through the hall like a soft peal of thunder. The stains on her emerald dress glistened under the light, but they no longer looked like symbols of shame. They looked like proof that even when drenched in cruelty, she stood untouchable. Chairs scraped against the marble floor as some guests, moved by an instinct they didn't understand, rose with her. They were unsure whether it was respect or fear that compelled them to their feet. The string quartet, still silent, lowered their bows altogether, sensing that the night had passed far beyond the realm of music. She turned toward the exit, her steps measured, each one echoing in the profound silence. No one blocked her way. No one dared to even breathe too loudly. As she passed, the sea of glittering guests shifted, parting before her like subjects before their sovereign. Just before she reached the grand doors, she paused. She looked back one last time, not at the empty space where Seraphina had stood, not at the cracked crystal glass left behind, but at the crowd itself. Her gaze swept over them, calm, resolute, and deeply seeing. "Power," she said, her final words a quiet lesson for a room that had forgotten its meaning, "doesn't come from spectacle. It comes from what you do after the spectacle is over." And with that, she stepped through the doors and was gone, leaving behind a hall that was drenched not in laughter but in a thick, profound, and terrified awe. The guests remained frozen in her wake. The whispers, the headlines, the frantic calls to brokers would all come later, on the trading floors, in the boardrooms, in the press. But for now the silence said it all. She had entered the evening as a guest they thought they could dismiss. She left it as the only name that would ever truly matter. This was a story about the night a queen, born of grit and brilliance, reminded a court of jesters what true power looks like. If this story resonated with you, if it stirred something inside you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded of their own strength. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because we bring you stories of quiet strength and loud impact every single week. Until next time, remember your worth, and never ever let anyone pour wine on your crown.